to all the students who have registered for ETH302S. The name of the module is Inclusive Education A, and the lecturers who will be supporting you during the semester are Dr. Ledwaba, and you see her contact details. The office number comes through on her soft phone, so she will receive your call on her laptop. And I am Mary Clasquin-Johnson, and there you see my contact details. If you have any questions, please feel welcome to email us, and we will respond to your emails as soon as we can. Please note that there are times that we are out of the office for research projects. So welcome to you all. In this module, you will work through the following study materials. We have a study guide for ETH302S. Please work very systematically through every study unit in your study guide and take note of the due dates of your assignments. And then we have Tutorial Letter 101. In the Tutorial Letter 101, we also indicate the assignments that you will have to complete during the course of the semester and the due dates. Compulsory reading for the module is White Paper 6 of 2001, the CS Policy of 2014. There is a list of glossary of important terminology related to inclusive education. Please study the glossary and the terminology and know it well. There is no prescribed book. This is a basic introductory module on inclusive education, and so you do not have to purchase any additional materials. But of course, we encourage students to read, articles, to read from the internet, to supplement your assignments, and to learn as much as you possibly can on support for learners to ensure their success within our education system. So this is White Paper 6. It's the policy on special needs education. It's called Building an Inclusive Education and Training System. It was introduced by the Department of Education in 2001. It has not changed. We are focusing on how to strengthen the implementation of White Paper 6. And you will see when you read the white paper, we have three types of schools in an inclusive education system. There are ordinary mainstream schools, then we have full service schools, and we also have special schools. And it's the needs of our learners that should determine what the most appropriate placement would be. But all three forms of schools provide inclusive education on a continuum of support. Please read the White Paper 6 closely. We are very concerned when we go out and do continuous professional development to teachers in our schools, when we hear that they have never seen or read the White Paper 6. So please read it, study it, and know it well. It has major implications for all of us as teachers and for how we support our learners. Our second compulsory reading is based on the policy on screening, identification, assessment, and support, which was introduced by the Department of Basic Education in 2014. Please know this policy and follow it closely. All teachers who provide support to learners who experience barriers to learning should implement the CS policy. Read the policy, study it closely, and know what the implications are for your teaching in your classroom. Then the content of the module includes the history of the South African education system. You will see that in this section of this study guide, we discuss all the discrimination, the inequalities that our education system was characterized by, and explain why this is now unacceptable in our democratic South Africa, and how we are striving, all of us as teachers, to ensure that the inequalities of the past are redressed, and we emphasize equity and equality for all learners. In the next section, we address inclusive education, and we want you to have a conceptual understanding of what inclusive education is. Next, we discuss the models of inclusive education, and we explain barriers to learning, and you will learn more about the internal or the intrinsic, as well as the external or extrinsic barriers to learning. Next, we focus more in depth on the process of screening, identification, assessment, and support. And that, once again, is based on the CIAS policy of 2014. In the next section, we discuss the roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders in education to provide support to our learners, to ensure that all learners reach their full potential. In the last section, we discuss curriculum differentiation, and we explain how you, as future teachers, should implement curriculum differentiation to ensure that you address the diverse needs of your learners. So that's the content of the module. So you'll see that in the module, we have 4 learning outcomes, and each learning outcome should be what we base all our assessment on. So you will, in your assignments and exam, need to show that you understand the history of education in South Africa and how we had a system that excluded learners who experienced barriers to learning, and that today we want to make sure that no one is excluded. In the second section, and our second outcome is linked to the next study unit, we describe the concept of inclusive education and its significance in relation to accessibility of the curriculum. So you need to pay very close attention to this outcome and prepare your self to have assessment activities on each of these outcomes. Our third outcome is to differentiate between mainstreaming and inclusion. So mainstreaming is what we had in the past, and inclusion is what we are striving for in the present. So you need to be able to explain very clearly what the difference between these 2 approaches to education is. Our next outcome is the different models that guide the implementation of inclusive education in South Africa. So please ensure that you familiarize yourself with these different modules and that you are able to discuss the features of these modules and how you as a teacher will implement it in your classroom practice. Let's look a little closer at the first outcome. As we've said, it's for you to explain or to demonstrate your understanding of how the history of South Africa has shaped the education system. So It's important that we understand that nothing we are doing is being done in isolation. Inclusive education is a global education movement, and it has been promoted worldwide, including in South Africa. Inclusive education was driven by a whole range of international and national legislation, policies, treaties, conventions. That means agreements between nation states of how education should be implemented all over the world. So these are global education priorities, okay, that promote education for all. So we talk about EFA, and EFA mandated the elimination of exclusion in education. And so to eliminate exclusion, we promote inclusive education for all learners, not some, not most, but every single learner. So we ask you to pay very close attention as you work through your study guide. You will encounter extensive discussions on the legislative and policy frameworks, especially White Paper 6. This is why you must read White Paper 6 and study it closely. And all the various processes that influenced White Paper 6 in South Africa, including the recommendations of the National Commission of Special Needs in Education and Training and the National Committee for Education Support Services. These were two very important processes that shaped White Paper 6. So pay attention to their recommendations. White Paper 6 is our policy mandate for including all learners in education in South Africa. If you are an international student who is based elsewhere on the African continent or elsewhere in the world, you will have your own country policies on education for all, in addition to those international conventions, treaties, and policies that have shaped how inclusive education should be implemented. And we acknowledge that we have not yet achieved the goal of education for all. And therefore, we continuously commit ourselves to training future teachers like yourselves to understand how to translate policy into practice in your classroom. Okay, so in the next section, we take a closer look at the concept of inclusive education. And here you need to understand that inclusive education is an educational framework. It is designed to ensure, firstly, access, secondly, participation, and thirdly, achievement for all learners, regardless of their differences or their support needs. These different characteristics of our learners could be cultural or race, language, ability, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. There may be other categories of differences, but regardless of these differences, we have the responsibility to ensure that we include all learners, regardless of their characteristics. So inclusive education promotes human rights. It recognizes that each and every single learner has the fundamental right to receive quality education. And this is aligned with social justice. And for ourselves as teachers, to realize that we must advance the social justice of all the learners in our schools and classrooms. And we have to ensure equality and equity within the education system. Inclusive education also aims to foster a democratic ethos in all our educational institutions. So, in summary, inclusion is about human rights, social justice, democracy, equality, and equity in education. In the next section, we pay attention to the 8 principles of inclusion. And you'll see that it's about acknowledging that all children and youth can learn and that all children and youth need support. So at various times within their journey through the education system, learners are likely to need support for whatever reason or for whatever challenges that they experience within their homes, within their own development. It may be attributed to internal or external barriers that you will learn about later on in the module. But at some time, everybody needs support. We need to accept and respect that all learners are different in some way. Diversity is a central feature of humanity. And so we find this in our classrooms. And regardless of their diversity, they must be equally valued. So we need to ensure that we create enabling education structures, systems, learning and teaching methodologies, actually, so that we meet these diverse needs of our learners. And as teachers, we must acknowledge and respect these differences in our learners, regardless of whether it's due to age, gender, ethnicity, language, class, disability, or HIV status. So the principles continue in the next section. We look at how we as teachers need to change our attitudes, our behaviors, the way we teach, the methods or strategies that we use, how we implement the curriculum, and how we create a learning environment that is conducive to learning because it meets the needs of all these diverse learners in the classroom. As teachers, we have to maximize the participation of all learners in the culture and the curricula of our educational institute by uncovering, which means we identify and then we address and minimize barriers to learning. Barriers are obstacles, they're blockages. And then as teachers, we need to empower our learners by developing their individual strengths and enabling them to participate critically and meaningfully in the process of learning. We want to ensure that all our learners are successful. And as teachers, we need to acknowledge that learning also occurs in the home and in the community and in all our community sort of organizations, and that it can be within formal and informal contexts. In other words, education is not only happening within our schools and other educational institutions. Education is happening throughout our lives and in all the contexts in which we find ourselves. It's important that we understand that inclusion in schools prepares for inclusion in society. In other words, what happens in schools is a reflection of the changes, the developments in society. And we need to understand that all societies globally are becoming more diverse and multicultural. It's a consequence of migration. At the moment, we have a war raging in Ukraine. There's been massive displacement. People have had to flee from their homes and seek refuge elsewhere. So migration is a consequence of all the conflict in the world, geopolitical reasons, and even climate change. And the result of this is that almost every classroom is more diverse ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and in terms of the socioeconomic backgrounds, the prior knowledge and experience of our learners who have diverse abilities. So schools and teachers must prepare all learners for meaningful inclusion in society and the world of work. We will not find learners who have barriers to learning in the workplace unless we as teachers prepare them to progress successfully through the education system. It's important that you pay close attention to the differences between mainstreaming and inclusive education. You will be required in one or other assessment task to differentiate very clearly between mainstreaming and inclusion. And so in the next slide, we give you some of the key features of mainstreaming and some of the key features of inclusive education. And here you'll see that in mainstreaming, the learner was forced to fit into an education system. And in contrast, inclusive education is about recognizing and respecting the differences among all learners. And there, as you see, are the other key features that distinguish mainstreaming from inclusive education. And what we want to emphasize is that inclusive education, these are the key features that we now join hands as teachers to implement. Please remember that school is coming increasingly diverse. We cannot avoid it. We must respond meaningfully to this diversity. And all learners must be supported to reach their full potential. That's our job as teachers. So they accommodate their individual needs, their interests, and their strengths. And unless we do this, we are not achieving our responsibilities as teachers. Okay, so there's two key models of disability historically, and we focus on learning support for all learners who encounter barriers to learning and also learners who have disabilities, because we believe that regardless of these characteristics, as we previously said, learners can learn and teachers should support them. So firstly, the medical model emphasizes increased awareness of barriers to learning and their prevalence. It emphasizes earlier diagnosis, and in South Africa, as you will learn about in more detail, we have the SIAS policy. We want to screen learners, we want to identify their needs, we want to assess them continuously, and we want to support them meaningfully. And earlier diagnosis enables us to have meaningful intervention and support. The medical model also increases accessibility to services or emphasizes access to services, and it strives to eliminate negative behaviors or characteristics through the provision of therapeutic interventions, what we call therapy, whether it's speech therapy or occupational therapy or psychotherapy. There's a whole range of therapeutic interventions that the medical model promotes. And then it also emphasizes environmental and genetic factors that could cause barriers. And in many instances, there's ongoing research, and we can't say definitely that these are the factors that cause this particular barrier. In some cases, it has been possible, and in other cases, that research is still ongoing. But regardless, you need to understand these main features of the medical model. Then next, we look at the social model to identify the strengths and the needs of ourselves and others. We identify barriers so that we can develop solutions. We emphasize that resources need to be available to ordinary services. So ordinary schools also need access to support services. And then we want to ensure that the society is evolving, that we are making progress, that we're more inclusive. So Tebogo was retained in every phase. His school's foundation phase head of department requested the school psychologist to perform an IQ assessment test to determine his cognitive abilities. The outcomes of the assessment identified intellectual barriers to learning and recommended placement at a special school for learners with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities. The assessment report stated that Tebogo was unlikely to reach grade 9 or cope with the academic demands of the curriculum. However, Tebogo's mother rejected the report and fought for her son to remain at the mainstream school. She insisted that the teachers should strengthen their support to her son by differentiating the curriculum to accommodate his strengths, interests, and needs. And in addition, she worked with the teachers to support her son at home. The teachers worked with Tebogo's mother to develop an individual support plan for Tebogo as mandated by the SIAS policy of 2014. Gradually, Tebogo's academic performance improved. He successfully completed his primary and secondary schooling, and then in 2017, he completed matric with a bachelor's pass. In 2018, Tebogo enrolled for a Bachelor of Information Science and is currently in his final year. Now, as teachers, we need to ask ourselves, what would have happened if Tebogo had not received the support he required? Dr. Ledwaba and I wish you a successful semester. Please contact us if you have any questions or if we can be of any support to you. And we ask you finally to work very systematically through your study material and to do your very best to submit quality assignments. Thank you very much and goodbye.